Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Yeah, so we will begin this session in continuation to our discussion on models of communication, which we started with discussing the traditional media. So, before getting into before continuing into this, I would quickly recap what we have done so far. We started the sessions with discussing the definitions of new media, what exactly is new in new media. We started reflecting on the definitions and the new aspects and the new characteristics of new media, and then we went into the models of communications, different models, which basically we began with the traditional media as a case study, and like we wanted to illustrate like the difference between the new and the traditional media. So, within the session models of communication, we started with different models of communications, which started with Ferdinand de Saussure's model, the addressee addresser code context model, and then we passingly referred to different David Berlow's model, Shannon Weaver model, and so on and so forth. The Roman Jakobson model, and the very last session what we did was the Stuart Hall model, the encoding decoding model. So, we will for the last session we talked about like the addresser addressee code context, and yeah. So, we did Ferdinand de Saussure's model, we discussed in short Roman Jakobson's model, and finally, we came to the Stuart Hall model. So, in today's session we will begin with the Stuart Hall model. Yes. So, we left off discussing Stuart Hall's model of encoding decoding. So, we talked about a quote, we talked about how stories in media, both traditional and new media, are encoded with certain political intent, certain ideology, certain ideological bias, and how the broadcaster or people who make the news, make the stories, make media, generate media content, would encode certain content, which are then decoded by the audience. So, we learnt about encoding and decoding, but taking off from here, like in today's session we are talking about like different kinds of readings that is possible for a media content, and this again is in continuation to the Stuart Hall discussion. So, the way the broadcaster or the generator of a news content encode a news content does not necessarily determine how the audience will decode it. So, So, if you remember what we mentioned the last time we discussed the encoding decoding model, is that the creators and the generators of news content, they encode a media content in certain way, and the audience, the recipient of the content, decode it in a certain way, and there is necessarily no guarantee that the way a media content has been encoded, it will be decoded in the same way. So, this is the novelty of the Stuart Hall model. So, Stuart Hall proposes that there are three ways in which one can read the media as a text, and Stuart Hall gives us this Yes, so Stuart Hall talks about these three possible types of readings. This is the three ways we can read a same piece of media, and these are called like dominant or hegemonic reading, oppositional reading, or counter hegemonic reading, and number 3 is negotiated reading. Now, let me give you an example, like what are these three ways of reading a text. So, the dominant reading is wherein the audience or the reader, when I say reader, it necessarily does not mean one who reads a text, like media content can also be read as a text. Like when I say reader, it also hints at the audience who watches watches television or reads a newspaper. So, like when I say reader, it is a generic umbrella term that covers like both the reader and the audience. So, dominant reading is wherein a reader unwittingly or otherwise completely buys into the ideological discourses of how the media text has been encoded. So, in other words, the audience or the reader is located within the same perspective, within the same set of coordinates from within which the media content has been encoded. In other words, they share the same point of view, the same codes, and the same ideological bias that the media content broadcasts. I will come to the examples, but let me quickly talk about the three kinds of readings, and I will illustrate these with examples shortly. Oppositional reading is wherein the reader reads the text against the grain, like completely subverts and rejects the dominant reading. In other words, they reject the code, the point of view, the coordinates, and the ideological bias with which the media content is encoded with. So, when the reader or the audience decodes it completely oppositionally or in direct opposition to the hegemonic coordinates of reading, then it is oppositional reading. So, negotiated reading is a kind of reading where the reader accepts the text in a way it has been coded, but not necessarily the audience buys into the complete ideological biases or the point of view. I mean, they perform when the audience performs the dominant reading to a large extent, while at the same time retaining some element of resistance to it. So, in other words, it is in between accepting and rejecting. It is a potentially it generates potentially unintended meanings when the dominant or the hegemonic set of codes are negotiated with some sort of opposition. So, in other words, I will quickly recap here. Dominant reading is the way the broadcaster wants to project a news story, a news feed. Oppositional reading is when the reader or the audience opposes the kind of reading or kind of political intent or ideological bias the news is being broadcasted with. So, in this case the reader understands the meanings and codes, the ideological biases, so to say, but she is at the same time sensitive to these biases, and they generate a kind of oppositional reading. Negotiated reading is some kind of in between, it is a negotiation between the dominant and the oppositional ways of reading. Now, let me give you an example to illustrate these three types of readings that Stuart Hall proposes. Think of a fairness cream advertisement that we often see on television. Any random fairness cream advertisements one can recall in this context. So, it is a cultural reproduction of certain set of ideological ideas which certain advertisements naturalize. Say for example, the fairness cream ad, it comes with certain set of assumptions with gender roles, gender stereotypes, racist prejudices, and so on and so forth. And if you look into the ad of fairness creams, and they mostly feature female subjects. So, it talks about gender, it talks about femininity, it talks about a certain kind of gender stereotypes, and it frames and it projects the ideas of femininity and gender in a certain way. So, this is in other words the dominant discourse. So, the media wants the consumers to buy fairness cream, and most of the target audience here in this case is female, and by doing so it furnishes certain ideological perspective upon gender, femininity, racist stereotypes, and so on and so forth. So, this is the dominant reading of a fairness cream advertisement. Whereas, the oppositional reading one could imagine, like the reader is sensitive to the gender stereotypes or the ideological biases or the gender biases, so to say, that goes into making this kind of ads. So, the reader does not give into the dominant set of codes, she understands the meanings and is sensitive to the biases. So, imagine for example, the series of slut walk parades that have happened. I mean, it is a global phenomenon that have happened across the world in the last few years in protest of the dominant representations of female subjects, gender violence, and ideas of queer perspective. So, imagine the slut walk perspectives. I mean, that is in direct repudiation to the kind of ideological bias that for example, the fairness cream advertisements come with. So, that would be an example of oppositional reading. Now, imagine someone who is somewhat critical of the hyperbolic truth claims that is immanent in the advertisement of certain brands of cream, like the fairness cream projects that if you use this cream, you will be fair in 7 days, and so on and so forth. So, these are hyperbolic truth claims to begin with. So, imagine someone who is critical about this kind of hyperbolic truth claims, but still uses the product and thereby endorses a certain kind of perceived notion about the importance of being fair, the importance of females being fair, and by doing so they endorse certain notions of femininity and masculinity, though he or she does not completely give into believing the hyperbolic truth claims. But then for example, nowadays you have fairness cream for like dedicated to a very niche male clientele. In other words, you have men's fairness cream, so to say. So, this would be a good example of negotiated reading, like you are not completely giving into the ideas of the claims that the advertisement propagate, not claims, the kind of ideological bias that these advertisements propagate. So, you are kind of suspicious about the importance of just only the importance of only the females wanting to be fair. So, you introduce a new set of product which is men's fairness cream. So, in other words, the idea of being fairness or the desire to be fair is the premise, is the base of the ideological bias here, so to say. But then the subjectivity is changed and you have a kind of a role reversal, where the imagination of the female fairness cream transposes onto the men's fairness cream. So, this would be an example of negotiated reading. So, so this is true, though that so what these three examples here in sum point to is the fact that no matter how you read media content, they come with certain ideological bias. So, you are completely either you completely give in to that, you start believing into those biases and stereotypes, either you oppose it. Also, in case you happen to oppose it, that opposition also is informed by a certain kind of political consciousness, political sensibility. So, that is also a kind of like a disposition, so to say. I would not say bias. Bias is probably a too strong a word here, but then also the kind of oppositional reading that we talked about is also informed by a certain kind of political sensibility, political consciousness, and also oppositional readings are also disposed to a certain kind of as I say like disposition. And so is the negotiated reading, as the example of the men's fairness cream will illustrate. Like so, in other words, what we are trying to suggest, taking cues from Stuart Hall, is the fact that media content, no matter how you prefer to read it, as the three examples would point, they are already predisposed to certain ideological intent. So, it is true though that those who maintain the ownership over the means of production, as in means of production of media content, in other words the broadcaster who generate media content, like who owns the necessary apparatus, the technological infrastructure that goes into generate media content, eventually get to control the relations of production. I am trying to get into the Marxist dichotomy between the base and the superstructure. I will come to that in a while, but let me think this this dichotomy in the context of how it relates to this kind of readings, like the Stuart Hall model. So, let me repeat here, like it is true though that those who maintain control over the means of production, who owns the technological apparatus, the infrastructure that is required to generate media content, would, I mean this is commonsensical, would be able to generate, would be able to exercise more control and more power over the relations of production, over the and the media content that is broadcast. Like if I own a news channel, if I own a media house, I would be able to, by just dint of having a stake, by having an ownership over the company, I would be able to exercise my power, my control over the content that is going to be broadcast in the media. So, this in sum, as I said, has been the basis of the Marxist staple against the capitalist systems of production since the 19th century. For the bourgeoisie, if you like recall the Marxist, I am trying to get into the Marxist base superstructure argument, like who the bourgeoisie who owns the means of production exploits the labor power in gaining control over the surplus production. So, now if we could transpose this Marxist idea onto our imagination of media, we could likewise argue that the economic or the political elite, say for example, like the broadcaster is a political elite in this context, because she owns the means of production, like who owns the media house, he owns the broadcasting corporation, would be able to exercise more control over the relations of production. So, in other words, there is a clear hierarchy between those who broadcast the media content and those who receive it, as in the audience. So, what I am trying to get at here is the hierarchy here, like people who generate the news content is in a more powerful position, is in the broadcaster is in a more powerful position, so as to exercise control and power over the media content, and the audience is a passive recipient of what the broadcaster broadcasts. So, this is like the Marxist model that explains, like I am not haven't gotten into the best superstructure thing yet, but this has been like the 19th century Marxist model that would be deployed mostly to understand the models of traditional media. But the novelty of Stuart Hall's approach, as we have discussed for the last session, and also through the three examples that we gave. So, the novelty in Hall's model that it puts an end to the docility or the passivity of the audience. So, this 19th century model, the Marxist model, as we said, associated with the audience or spectator, audience or spectator, that is the recipients of media, assumes some kind of a passivity, some kind of docility. So, the Stuart Hall model, what we have seen so far is questioning this hierarchy between the broadcaster, who is the owner of the means of production, who generates content, and the spectator, the reader, the audience, who reads the media, watches the news, and so on and so forth. So, Stuart Hall's model questions this basic hierarchy. Just as we saw in the case of the three examples, the audience or the reader is now the Stuart Hall model renders the audience like it equips the audience to be able to perform oppositional reading, it enables, it equips the audience to perform negotiated reading. So, in other words, the audience here is empowered. So, the Stuart Hall model questions this hierarchy, the passivity of the audience. So, what Stuart Hall shows us is that decoding of a text is of no less importance than encoding it. If encoding a text is important, decoding a text, as the oppositional reading or negotiated reading examples would show, these are equally important. So, now let us recap, let us go back to what we started the discussion with. Like I started the discussion with saying that the way a news content or a piece of media text is encoded does not necessarily determine that it would be decoded in the same way. So, the Stuart Hall model empowers the audience insofar as the audience is now capable of producing her own reading of a text through oppositional reading, through negotiated reading. The audience or the reader is empowered so as someone is able to question the dominant reading of a text, the hegemonic codes and the ideological bias the art text, news text or a media text has been encoded with. So, more to it, a text now can emit multiple meanings, like Stuart Hall gives us examples of 3 readings, but this could be multiplied, and as we go on, will realize in the case of new media these possibilities are manifold. So, now a text, a media text can emit multiple meanings and disjunctive iterations depending on who decodes it and how. Like it is not just about the broadcaster alone. So, it is not just about who encodes it, what kind of ideological bias or political intent. It is not restricted to considering who encodes it. It is also the Stuart Hall model, as it is pointing, it is also about the multiple meanings that a text can now generate, and it is dependent and it is contingent upon who is reading a text and how.